Well, it's quite dark here today. It's fairly early in the morning. The sun's not going to come up, not that I can see, because it's very thick cloud out there. So I'm working partly by window light and partly by artificial light. Now, I've turned off one of the lights because my video camera was throwing a great shadow across the work area here. So, given that was the case, it probably wasn't casting much useful light on the job, just creating unwanted contrast. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if this isn't a little bit soft, given the poor light, but we'll just deal with what we've got. The shutter itself. Well, there's every reason to believe that this works fairly well, and I think it'll just need to be stripped and cleaned. First, I've got to rotate this little lock. Then I can rotate the front trim ring here to unbalance it from the shutter body, and we're done. We're in. Okay, so this is the shutter speed settings cam plate, and these indentations you see here is where it controls the position of the arm on the retard gear train. Anyway, put that to one side. Just unhook a couple of springs, one here from the little latch that holds the shutter cocked, one from the main lever, lift this out of the body. That B lever's catching on it for one reason or another. Here we go. It's the main lever out of the camera. The shutter release lever can be wriggled off its post. And the disassembly can start. I'll start by removing this screw here, which holds the B lever in position, and it also holds the spring, return spring for the B lever. The other end of that spring acts against this lever, which forms part of that flash sync mechanism and latches the shutter in the cocked position. I'll remove that screw from that end of the flash sync mechanism, and that one at this end. Those screws were quite tight. Here's our settings lever. This plate, it sits over a pin here and a pin here, and it's tucked under the edge of the casting at that point, so I've got to lift it up. Just lifting under this with a tip of my tweezers. You don't want to distort this plate, otherwise you find that this lever in particular won't move smoothly if that plate's distorted. That's it, it's off. Two little brass standoffs. This lever's done its best to become, this is two pieces fixed together with a little spring, and it's doing its best to separate. That's still in one piece. I'll unhook this spring from its post. That's it. Had my finger over that so it couldn't fly away across the room. They're pretty good at zooming away. Lift this lever out. The flash contact here and the little actuating arm for the flash contact, lift those out together. The high speed spring, it does the 500th of a second speed. Here's the little wheel which drives the pallets and also has a cam on the top of it which swings that flash lever across. Here are the pallets for the flash sink, and the pallet wheel is fixed to that plate. Alright, I'll turn this over. I want to get the outer case off the shutter. Now we've got two screws there. One here and one here. There's a hole in this cover at that point. Nothing goes in that hole. It's just there to confuse you. If I slide that case back, don't go mad sliding it back, you've still got your flash contact wire hooked up here. Got to loosen the screw for the clamp, back that off a couple of turns. I'm not removing that screw completely, it's a little grub screw. I'll remove it shortly, but not just yet. Right, so I've unhooked my flash wire. There it is there. Here's the curved rack which cocks the shutter. This is the detent for our aperture settings. That's the outer case off here. Next I want my flash post, contact post out. It's held in by a single screw. This is only some very vulnerable styrene type plastic, easily damaged, don't get solvent anywhere near it. Now I'll remove that little black screw that I just backed off previously. There will be a tiny black plastic insulating slug in here somewhere. And oh, the flash contact fell out all by itself. That was marvellous. Normally you've got to poke and prod at them. And that fine rectangle, that square post there, has got a hole down the middle of it that the wire goes through. Well, there's not much plastic left. Now normally that's fragmented. I can see cracks in that, but at least it's in one piece. And there is the tiny black plastic insulating slug that I said was needed to be recovered. And it's just an insulator. If you lose it, you can use any small piece of insulating material, plastic, to go back in its place. 3 screws here hold the mechanism plate and the case together. I'll just loosen them in turn. I've got to go and get my all-purpose block of wood because it makes it much easier for working on things. Okay, so the screws are loose. Now in each case I had the shutter firmly down against the bench here while I was undoing those screws. And I was able to keep a lot of downward pressure on the screwdriver so that the screwdriver didn't cam out of the screw heads, make a mess of them and make it awkward to get the screws out. You don't want your screwdriver slipping. Right, so here's our mechanism plate with the shutter blades all present. I'm just having a quick look at this, see if there's anything odd about it. No number 1 blades in the number 1 blade position. All the blades are assembled in the normal direction. That all looks good. Here's the diaphragm in the shutter case. Now this moves smoothly. Doesn't look like there's any problem with that at all. I'm going to strip it and clean it anyway, because I always do. First I want to remove the settings lever here. Now if you swing it into the right position, there are 2 cutouts in the back plate here. If you swing the lever in the right position, you'll expose the screw heads for the shoulder screws that hold all that together. And we're in the picture only just. So I've got that supported on the edge of my wooden block. Loosen one screw, turn this around, do the same on this side. The settings lever swings away, put that to one side. Turn this upside down and we can recover the 2 shoulder screws that held that in place. Now here we have 3 screws that hold the retainer plate in place. One of them is a countersunk screw, the other 2 are plain. It's not hard to tell where they go back, because obviously there's only one countersunk position on that plate. The other 2 screws are identical with each other. Right, we'll tip that lot out. So I've got my case. Here's the moving plate. Here are the diaphragm blades. Now there's some marks on those. That may be oil. Very likely it is. And in which case that'll probably clean off. And the retaining plate looks good. It's not showing any signs of corrosion and etched in fingerprints or anything. That all looks very good. So those parts just need to be cleaned in naphtha with cotton buds. And the mechanism plate here, that'll need the same treatment, but I'll start with the diaphragm. I cleaned the diaphragm blades. They were slightly marked with oil. There's certainly residual marks on there from where the blades overlap. Those marks aren't going to go away short of polishing them away, and that's a little bit exciting with diaphragm blades, so they won't be getting polished. It moves nicely. I'm satisfied that the blades have no oil on them. That's the number 1 thing to be satisfied with. Everything else moves nice and smoothly. So the diaphragm blades were good. The shutter blades, I've cleaned them too. There was no particular problem with those, no roughness, no corrosion, just a little bit of oil on them. Nothing serious at all. The mechanism plate, likewise, I've disassembled this, cleaned it, removed all the old grease, flushed out the retard gear train with naphtha, lubricated this with some graphite powder. There was a bit of grease on the blade actuating ring here. That was a little bit dried out looking, probably a bit tackier than it should have been. I've lubricated that with graphite powder after I cleaned it all. But I'm quite happy that that's all moving freely and as it should now. And so I can put my shutter blades in place and then close the case. So I'll unhook that return spring, swing that into the blade's open position and start putting the shutter blades in place. And the first shutter blade has an extra hole in it to identify it, and that's all it does. And that fits here. Unlike diaphragm blades, of course, shutter blades just lay one on top of the other, so there is a first blade and a last blade. diaphragm blades are interleaved, so all blades are equal regarding that. Okay, so there's all my shutter blades in place. I can put the case back over that. So it's easy to line the case up because you've got the square hole there for the flash sink, so it's easy to see where that will go. That dropped into place. There are 3 screws that hold the mechanism plate and the case together. I'll do those screws up quite lightly, just in case one of the shutter blades shifted while I was putting the case over the top. I want to damage a blade by trapping it between the pins and the case. No, that's all good. I can put that spring in there. That all moves smoothly. And those 3 screws I can tighten up. That's it, that was easy. The retard gear train is nice and prompt in its action there, nice and smooth. Now I can put the componentry back onto the mechanism plate. Well, I'll start putting things back in here. Start with the flash contact. The brass plate's sort of stuck to the bottom of this at the moment. Normally it's not. Wriggled that down into place. It's got to be fairly gentle with that plastic flash contact block because they're very fragile. As I said, they're made out of some sort of styrene-like plastic, and any touch of solvent they just turn to spludge. Here's the pallets. And the wheel that drives that pallet wheel here has a little cam on the toe of it and that moves the flash contact. Now the toe of that cam, I normally lubricate that with just a little wipe of molybdenum paste. And you know you've got enough on there if you can see a vaguely dirty mark. You don't need any more than that. That looks good. This is the high-speed spring, the 500th of a second spring. Just put that in place over its post. I'll put a wipe of molybdenum paste through the centre of that, though I hardly think that would make any difference to the way it works. Get this flash contact and lever in place. They seat over a little post on the mechanism plate, and just got to make sure it's seated correctly before you put the screw in. Run that screw down, making sure that the lever's not sitting on top of that cam when you're tightening the screw up. That seems fine. This lever, which is 2 pieces, and it's just held together by the tension of a tiny spring on the underside there, which in this case is sitting correctly. the timing of this thing right. Oh, that spring's just popped out of place, has it? Let's see. I think it's still hooked up. Get that piece back where it should be. Why is it reluctant to sit there? That's a bit of a mystery. It's sitting there. Is it sprung loaded? Yeah, it's sprung loaded, so the spring's in place. Just getting the timing of this right, so that when this latch is across, stopping this from moving this way, the point of this cam is towards the centre of the shutter, and so this arm can move freely down the side of that cam there. That's correctly placed. I can get its spring hooked up, at least that's the idea. So the spring goes from the hole in that arm to this post on this side, the outer post. And with luck, it clicks in straight away, no fights. That's looking good. We've had two brass standoffs. That sit there and there. And then this plate, which I haven't cleaned yet. Okay, let's see if I can get this a little bit further assembled. Getting this bracket on, this tab on the bracket goes into a slot under here, so you've got to sort of hook this thing into the slot like that, and it's got to go over that post, that pin, and over this pin, all at the same time. Of course, this spring, you need to keep that aligned so that the pin comes up on the right side of that spring. Okay, that looks like it went fairly smoothly. I'll put that screw in there. Just run that down lightly. It passes through that brass spacer, so I was just looking under there to make sure that that indeed is what had happened, and the brass spacer hadn't fallen out and gone somewhere else. This screw is a shoulder screw that the little green MX flash sync lever revolves around. That's good, and tighten that up. Tighten that screw up at the other end. Now this detent spring for that lever, I've got to bring that round and hook it against that pin on the green lever. That's moving nicely. The B lever. It sits on there. And the screw that holds that in place has the return spring for the B lever and that other little lever there. Getting this in place is sometimes entertaining because the spring sometimes falls off, and then you've got a bugger of a job getting everything seated again. Just see if that'll go for me. Okay, so that screw is basically done up. Now I've got to get the spring correctly seated. This hook part of the spring has to come round to the lever at this point. It didn't, it just pinged off over the top. See if I can get that back out and hooked into place. No, it's certainly not wanting to play the game today. No, it's really not. Normally it's not as much of a problem to get this to stretch around behind that lever and click into place, but it is in place now. Now the other end of the spring here, I've got to get onto the inside of that lever, so I've got to get under the spring with my tweezers, lift it across, put it on the inside of the lever, check that my B lever moves freely. I often get a bit distorted. It shouldn't be sticking up in the air so much. That looks okay. So as the main lever comes round, the tab on the main lever hits this piece here, draws it across, which cocks the action of the flash sync mechanism. And when the shutter's released, this piece releases and the flash sync mechanism runs down. It appeared to work to me. Yep, definitely is. So that's all go. I think that the shutter release lever should go in next. I'll just clean that. Just a small spot of corrosion on that lever there. I'm not sure why that should particularly be like that. Now getting this seated, you have to get that spring tucked down into that gap, get the lever seated over that tiny pivot pin, and there it is. Now if we cock this mechanism, it allows you to move your shutter release and release that mechanism. If it wasn't cocked, you can't move this lever because that mechanism blocks you from being able to depress the shutter release. That saves you from being able to depress the shutter release when the shutter's not cocked. That's good, so I'll cock that once more, put that to one side. I really need to look at the main lever and clean this. There's not much to go wrong with this typically, it's usually fine. The spring on this is the main spring that drives the shutter. And I expect that they've lost some tension over time. I certainly don't have any new replacement springs for them. It's reasonable to assume that they have lost some power, and once upon a time the shutters would drive the shutters a little bit faster. Really what happens with the shutter is this piece under tension of its spring swings back, swings the blades open and so forth, but the blades themselves are returned to the closed position by this tiny spring here. So if there's any stickiness in the mechanism at this point, it doesn't matter how much force you put into the opening of the blades, they're going to be slow to close if there's any stickiness here. So the closing is half of your action basically. You've got one mechanism which opens the blades. The deep retard gear train helps determine how long those blades are open. Once they're allowed to release, this little tiny spring here is the only thing slamming those blades shut again at the end of your exposure. Right, so with everything clean, a little bit of lubrication to the main lever and the shutter, and we're done.